My brother-in-law lost his job and now wants to live at my house rent-free. He has been lazy, he is a dirty slob, and my wife is taking his side. I, 34M, was married to my wife Sarah, 32F, for 8 years. We had been living in my house that I had purchased before we got married. It was a decent 3-bedroom home in a nice neighborhood. About 6 months ago, Sarah's brother Tom, 28M, had been kicked out of his apartment due to not being able to pay rent after losing his job during the pandemic. His funds had been completely drained, and he had nowhere to go. Sarah had insisted that he come stay with us temporarily until he could get back on his feet financially. I had been reluctant at first, as I valued my privacy and personal space. However, after Sarah had pleaded with me, stating that Tom was family and had no other options, I had agreed to let him stay in our spare bedroom for a few months. Tom had moved in with just a few suitcases of belongings. For the first couple of weeks, everything had been fine. He had kept to himself, cleaned up after himself in the common areas, and had been actively applying for jobs. However, after about a month, Tom's behavior had started changing. He had begun spending more time lounging around the house playing video games instead of job hunting. His bathroom habits had become incredibly disgusting, leaving pubic hairs everywhere, pee stains on the toilet, and the bathroom constantly reeked of his horrible body odor. He had also begun eating all of our food without contributing anything. I addressed these issues with Tom multiple times in a polite manner, but he always responded dismissively, saying he would try to do better, but never followed through. Sarah had initially taken my side on these matters, agreeing that Tom needed to respect our home and hunt for a job seriously. However, after a couple of months, she had started making excuses for his laziness and messiness, saying he was just going through a rough time and I should cut him some slack. By 4th month of Tom's stay, I had reached my boiling point. Not only had his disgusting behavior continued, but he had started bringing random friends over without asking, blasting loud music and video games all night, and even vaping indoors, leaving the house smelling like a nightclub. I had to put my foot down and insisted Tom either straighten up and start job hunting seriously, or he would need to find another place to stay. This led to a massive blowout argument between Sarah and I. Sarah had shockingly taken Tom's side and stated, "What's the big deal? He's just having some fun after going through a rough patch. Why are you being so uptight and cruel to my own brother?" I had been dumbfounded that she was justifying and enabling Tom's complete lack of responsibility or respect as a guest in my house. When I had refused to back down on giving Tom an ultimatum, Sarah had given me an ultimatum of her own. "If you kick Tom out, I'm leaving with him. You'll have to choose between us." In that moment, I had realized my marriage was already over. The fact that Sarah was so willing to ditch her marriage vows and home over letting her bum loser brother walk all over me had shown where her priorities truly were. Her family would always come before me, no matter how disrespectful or out of line their behavior was. So, I had made the difficult decision to tell Sarah that if that was her choice, so be it. Tom would be the one staying, and she would be the one leaving, not the other way around. It was my house that I had owned before the marriage, and I was not going to let them kick me out of my own home. Needless to say, this led to World War III between Sarah and I. She had called me every insult in the book: selfish, heartless, controlling, abusive, and more. She had accused me of choosing some brick walls over your wife, and had stated that I would live to regret ruining our marriage over this. She had quickly packed up some belongings and stormed out, going to stay with her parents for the time being. However, in her rage, she had forgotten some important documents and sentimental items that held significance to her. A couple days later, she had sent Tom over to collect those remaining belongings of hers. I have to admit, a part of me had been tempted in that moment to use her things as a bargaining chip to get Tom out of my house. However, I had taken the high road. No items had been kept from Tom, and he had been able to collect everything of Sarah's that she wanted. As he had left with her things, he had also stated that I would regret this decision, and that she was the best thing that ever happened to me. In the 2 months since, I had started the legal process for divorce from Sarah. She had continued trying to pressure me into allowing Tom to remain in my home, stating that he had nowhere else to go, and I would be ruining his life by kicking him out. However, I had refused. Tom had brought this situation upon himself through his lack of ambition and disrespect of boundaries. I owed him nothing. My soon-to-be ex-wife could choose to let her bum brother mooch off her if she wanted, but there was no way he would be staying in my house anymore. Ultimately, Tom had finally found a new place to move into after I had stuck to my guns. However, the damage had been done to my marriage over this situation. Sarah had made it clear her brother would always be her priority over me. So Reddit, AITA for not allowing my lazy, disrespectful brother-in-law to keep living in my house rent-free, even though it led to the end of my marriage? I basically had to choose between enabling Tom's loser behavior or losing my wife. I do not think I was the asshole here at all, but I would be interested to hear some outside perspectives. Update 1. I know it's been several months since I last updated this situation, but a lot has happened that I need to get off my chest. What I'm about to explain may seem crazy and unbelievable, but I swear on my life every word is the truth. After the events of my last post, where my marriage to Sarah had self-destructed over her enabling her lazy bum of a brother Tom, life had been difficult, but I was trying to move forward. The divorce proceedings with Sarah had been underway, though she had continued insisting that I allow Tom back into my home before she would agree to any settlement. Of course, I had refused, having been pushed way too far by Tom's disgusting behavior and lack of respect towards my home and rules. Tom had eventually found a new place after I had kicked him out, though I had still been on the hook for paying rent at that place per Sarah's demands if I wanted the divorce settled somewhat easily. I had been focusing on work, trying to bury myself in my career to take my mind off the pain of my marriage crumbling over such an idiotic reason, Sarah's blind devotion to her loser brother over her husband. I had kept replaying all the fights and insults in my mind, her calling me selfish and abusive for simply wanting basic respect and responsibility in my own home. Part of me had wondered if I was the bad guy after all, for letting my pride and stubbornness ruin an 8-year marriage. Maybe I should have just continued putting up with Tom's crap to keep the peace with Sarah. But another part of me knew that her priorities were completely off, and enabling Tom's loser lifestyle would have only continued the problem long-term. In any case, for several months, I had tried to simply move on and accept that my marriage was over. I had gotten accustomed to having the house to myself again, not having to walk on eggshells around Tom's mess and odors. I had started making some home improvements and redecorating to my own taste, something I couldn't have done with Sarah's input. However, about a month ago, something strange had happened that reopened this can of worms. I had been out doing some grocery shopping when I had bumped into an old friend from college named Jake. Jake and I had been pretty close buddies back in our university days, though we had drifted apart once we entered our careers and he got married with kids. After exchanging some basic catch-up chit-chat, Jake had cautiously asked me, "Hey man, I have to ask, are the rumors true that you and Sarah split up because you kicked out her brother for being lazy?" I had been a bit taken aback that mine and Sarah's private marital issues had seemingly become public gossip. But I had figured it was a small town, and these things tend to spread like wildfire when people get divorced. So I had confirmed to Jake that yes, that was essentially the situation that led to our separation. To my surprise, Jake had reacted with an expression of disbelief. He had then said something shocking that had never even crossed my mind. "Dude, what if I told you the story you think you know is only scratching the surface? That things are way more messed up than you could ever imagine?" I had pressed Jake for more details, but he had been initially hesitant to reveal anything, saying he didn't want to spread unverified rumors. However, after I had insisted and reminded him of our old bond of trust, Jake eventually agreed and began explaining something that, if true, made me question everything I thought I knew. According to Jake, he had a close friend named Brian who had known Tom for years, going back to their high school days. Though Jake didn't personally know Tom well, he had heard plenty of stories about what a deadbeat loser Tom was from Brian over the years. Constantly borrowing money from friends to fuel his lazy lifestyle, mooching off girlfriends, you name it. Well, according to what Brian had told Jake, Tom's sponging off me and Sarah had apparently been no accident or coincidence. It had been a calculated long-term plan by not just Tom, but also his friend Brian. As the story went, about a year prior, when things were still going well in my marriage, Brian had attended a party where he locked eyes with Sarah. According to Jake, Brian had immediately been mesmerized by Sarah's beauty and had been determined to pursue her, even though he knew she was married to me. Tom owed a huge sum of money to Brian, thousands of dollars, from some past debts and misadventures. Brian had been constantly hounding Tom to pay up, threatening trouble if he didn't get his money. That's when Brian had hatched a plan. He would convince Tom to pursue essentially breaking up my marriage to Sarah. If Tom could insert himself into our household and slowly turn Sarah against me, eventually driving a wedge that would lead to our divorce, well, then Brian would have a chance to slither his way in and pursue the newly single Sarah for himself. In return for Tom's efforts in breaking up my marriage, Brian would waive the huge debt that hung over Tom's head, finally relieving him of that burden. A win-win for those two jackals. I had listened to Jake's story in utter disbelief and disgust. There was no way Tom could be that big of a scumbag, was there? To actively work on sabotaging his own sister's marriage, just so his sleazeball friend could have a chance with her? But Jake had insisted. Everything he was telling me came directly from Brian's mouth, and the timeline seemed to line up perfectly. Tom had started mooching off Sarah and me soon after Brian first saw her and became infatuated. Tom's behavior had suddenly shifted to being a repulsive, lazy slob not long after that as well. According to Jake, Brian had been giving Tom constant advice and instructions on how to slowly turn Sarah against me over time. Little by little, making me out to be the bad guy who was too uptight and cruel for simply wanting baseline responsibilities and respect in my own home. Pitting Sarah against me by constantly saying I was being unreasonable in my expectations of Tom. It had all originated from Brian's obsession with my wife and desire to snake his way into a relationship with her by destroying my marriage in the process. With Tom's help as the inside man chipping away at Sarah's love for me, they had achieved their goal. Hearing all of this had felt like being punched in the gut repeatedly. For months, I had been torturing myself wondering if I was the asshole who had cruelly prioritized my house over my wife's own flesh and blood brother. But if the revelations from Jake were true, then it had all been one long planned con by Tom and Brian. Even beyond the pain of the betrayal, it hurt hugely to think about the inevitable toll this truth would have taken on Sarah herself. To realize she had been nothing more than a pawn used by her own brother to sabotage her marriage, all in the service of setting her up for Brian to eventually sleep with. The depraved betrayal of trust and deceit from Tom and this Brian scumbag was staggering. I had spent the next few days in an emotional spin, unable to concentrate at work as these horrific revelations consumed my mind. I had pressed Jake for any other details he could provide, including how trustworthy of a source his friend Brian was for this. While Jake admitted Brian was a bit shady at times, he insisted there was no way Brian could have fabricated a story this elaborate and perfectly timed. Finally, I had made the decision that I needed to get to the bottom of this, no matter how painful the truth might be. I had resolved to go directly to the source, Tom, and confront him face to face. If I got him away from the potential manipulation of Brian, maybe I could get Tom to finally come clean about everything. I had texted Tom asking if we could meet up for a conversation, and to my surprise, he had agreed relatively quickly. We had decided on a quiet diner near his new place for the meeting. When I had arrived, Tom had been waiting with the same smug look and dismissive body language he always had. "All right, man, you said you wanted to talk?" Tom had said as I took a seat across from him. "What's on your mind?" I had taken a deep breath, deciding in that moment to be blunt rather than dance around the subject. "I know everything, Tom. I know about the plan you and your buddy Brian hatched to sabotage my marriage." The smirk had immediately disappeared from Tom's face upon hearing my words. His eyes had gone wide with a look of shock and panic, giving me all the confirmation I needed that what I had learned was true. I don't know what you're talking about, man," Tom had stuttered out unconvincingly, unable to maintain eye contact with me. "Don't even try to deny it," I stated firmly. "I know all about how your scumbag friend Brian got obsessed with my wife Sarah after seeing her at a party, and I know all about the twisted deal you two made." Tom had stayed silent, shifting uncomfortably in his seat as I had laid out the details I knew of their scheme. "Brian agreed to waive all the money you owed him if you could successfully insert yourself into our home and slowly turn Sarah against me over time, driving a rift between us until our marriage crumbled. Also, Brian could have a chance to pursue a newly single Sarah for himself." The lack of protest or denial from Tom had told me everything. Eventually, his gaze had dropped to the table, unable to even look me in the eye anymore. I had felt such a consuming combination of rage, disgust, and heartbreak in that moment. "You're a real piece of work, Tom," I spat out, struggling to keep my voice down in the diner. "Betraying your own sister, sabotaging her marriage, just so your loser buddy could have a shot at getting with her. Do you have any idea how messed up and cruel that is?" Tom had finally started muttering some garbled responses about owing Brian money, needing a place to stay, getting in over his head with manipulation from Brian. But it had all sounded like pitiful excuses and justifications to me. "Save it," I had cut him off. This was one of the most depraved, disgusting betrayals I could ever imagine. And the worst part is how you involved and used Sarah as a pawn in your twisted little game. I had wondered if I should tell Sarah the full truth of what her brother had done. Part of me wanted to protect her from the devastation of learning her own sibling had played such an active role in sabotaging her marriage for his own selfish interests. But another part knew she deserved to know the full extent of Tom's reprehensible actions and betrayal. In that moment at the diner, with the truth finally out in the open between us, I had made the decision to completely cut Tom out of my life, regardless of what came next with Sarah. "You're done, Tom," I had stated, standing up from the table. "I don't ever want to see or hear from you again. If you so much as come near me or try contacting me, I'll make sure the full truth about what you pulled gets plastered all over this town." Tom had sat there, finally deflated without his trademark smirk and casual attitude to hide behind. As I had turned to leave the diner, he had finally found some words. "You'll regret this." And when Brian, I had cut him off immediately, feeling a surge of fury and disgust. "If you or your degenerate buddy Brian ever comes near me or Sarah again, you'll wish you had never been born." With that, I had stormed out of the diner, still feeling a swarm of emotions. Hatred towards Tom, disgust at Brian's depravity, torment at the manipulation Sarah had been subjected to by her own blood without even realizing. I had decided Sarah needed to know everything, no matter how painful. Maybe learning the circumstances would finally open her eyes to the manipulation she had been subjected to. I had asked Sarah if we could meet up in a public place, saying I had something incredibly important to discuss regarding the ending of our marriage. To her credit, she had agreed, without protest. We had met at a quiet cafe, and I could sense her anxiety and discomfort in the air immediately. As calmly as I could, I had begun walking her through everything Jake had told me about the plan between Tom and his friend Brian. At first, she had reacted with disbelief, unable to believe that her own brother being capable of such cruelty and deceit. But as I had laid out all the pieces of the puzzle, the timeline, the specific details, her expression had slowly started to change. By the end, I could see it all clicking into place for Sarah, the consistent encouragement from Tom to take his side against me, his apparent obsession with inserting himself into our marriage and living situation, his advice that I was being unreasonable for my attitude on his lack of responsibility. It had all been an accurately calculated effort to drive Sarah and I apart, all in service of Brian's messed-up obsession and deal with Tom. Tears had started streaming down Sarah's face as the full, harsh reality settled in. To her credit, she had not tried to make excuses or rationalize Tom's actions at all. I think she realized, just like I did, that this was a new low of depravity that could not be explained away or justified whatsoever. She had immediately attempted to contact Tom to confront him, but he had pointedly dodged all of her calls and messages. Eventually, she had told me she just felt completely sick to her stomach, sick about the lengths Tom had gone to sabotage her own marriage in such a cruel, selfish way, and sick about the realization of how badly she had been manipulated and used as a pawn. In that moment, I saw the woman I fell in love with all those years ago, the sweet, kind-hearted person who would never intentionally hurt anyone. Sarah had been an innocent victim of Tom's deception, just as much as I had. Despite the anguish of our marriage ending, I didn't have it in me to stay angry or resentful towards Sarah after that conversation. If anything, I felt a strange sense of relief that she now saw Tom for the depraved snake that he was, just like I did. We had spent a long time talking through everything that day, re-examining her interactions with Tom during his stay at our house through a new lens of realization. So many of his comments and behaviors that had once seemed innocent or ambiguous suddenly took on a new, sinister meaning when viewed through the context of the truth we now knew. Sarah had made it clear she now recognized how terribly misguided she had been in enabling Tom's terrible behavior towards me. No more excuses, no more justifications. She got it. We had both resolved that day to do whatever it took to permanently cut the cancer of Tom out of our lives. Sarah had been every bit as disgusted by Brian's depraved obsession and role in all of this as I was. On some level, we had bonded again over our mutual hatred for those two rascals who had exploited our marriage. In the weeks and months that followed, Sarah and I had an open line of communication during our divorce proceedings. While we both still felt our marriage was too damaged to piece back together, there were no longer any lingering resentments or bad blood between us, which helped immensely. We had made a pact to immediately cut off all contact and communication with Tom indefinitely, refusing to let him worm his way back into our lives or make any more excuses. He had made his depraved choices, and he could live with those consequences. As for his scumbag friend Brian, we had agreed that if he ever tried to contact or pursue Sarah in any way, we would not hesitate to get police involvement and file restraining orders. His twisted obsession and entitlement over Sarah had gone way too far already. In any case, for as nightmarish as this whole experience was, I'm just grateful Sarah and I have both emerged on the other side with an odd sense of clarity, boundaries re-established. While our marriage may be over, an incredible weight and burden has been lifted off both of our shoulders. We don't have to dwell in the anger, confusion, and self-doubt of being gaslit and exploited by those two depraved sociopaths any longer. The truth has allowed us to regain our self-respect and self-trust. As we go our separate ways and start new chapters, I think we're both determined to pay forward the hard lessons we learned here, to spot the red flags of toxic personalities,